Hello, students. Today's presentation before us is titled Patronage to Temples. Now, before going on with our presentation, we would first like to delineate the time frame of the early medieval period in India, which spans basically a period from circa 600 to 1200 Common Era. Now, this period in Indian history has been characterized by several features, amongst which we have the emergence of regional cultures and several religious identities. Now, another interesting development during this period was marked by the very close and apparently symbiotic relationship shared between religious orders on the one hand and political potentates on the other. This period was also marked by the emergence of Hindu religious identities, buttressed as they were by generous munificence on the part of regional potentates. Often, this took the form of lavish patronage that was extended to art and architecture in general and to temple construction in particular. So, again, a brief outline of the presentation would make us see that temples dotted the Indian landscape throughout. Protected as they were by kings and widely supported as they were by endowments and other gifts. Temples, therefore, came to enjoy ascendancy as religious centers, as sites for socio-economic activities, and as hubs of artistic and craft production. In this presentation of ours, we would also like to explore the role of politics and kingship in formulating a new ideology of governance, wherein we would also like to explore the patron-protege binaries. And here I would like to harp on learned individuals, i.e., the Brahmanas, and ecclesiastical institutions, i.e., the temples. We know that royal patrons started expressing their political agendas through religious donations, and here we would like to concentrate on temple construction. Now, for that, we first need to know about the Bhakti movement, and as the famous historian D.D. Koshambi would have liked to put it, Bhakti, with its focus on devotion and loyalty, was well suited to the needs of the feudal state. Reiterating a similar sentiment later on, historian D.N. Jha also suggested that the emergence of later day temples as landed magnets and as centers of political power also made them an integral part of the entrenched feudal setup. Now, Bhakti, being as it was a temple-based movement, helped legitimize feudal social relations. We also need to study the close nexus that existed between the kings, the Brahmanas, and the temples, of course. Now, several land grant inscriptions throw a great deal of light and eulogize kings for being not only the custodians of dharma, but they also eulogize kings for their generous magnanimity as well. Kings have often been compared to kolpobrikhos, i.e., the trees of plenty. Why? Because they donated land, gold, grain, cows, and elephants initially to the Brahmins before the 10th century and later on to the temples in the post 10th century period. Bhumi Dan, or the gift of land, specially to Brahmins and to temples, formed a pious activity that was appropriate for kings. And it formed a part of the several integrative and legitimizing policies that were consciously adopted by kings. For fledgling kingdoms that came up throughout the early medieval period in India, across the entire Indian subcontinent, these religious associations with established socio-religious groups, and here I would like to intend the Brahmins, and institutions like the temples proved politically advantageous for political orders. This, however, that is Bhumidan or grant of land, did not, however, imply any loss of revenue or the loss of political control by the kings. So, royal grants to Brahmins, as I said, started from the 10th century onwards. We would also, in this context, try and explore the Brahmanization of the royal courts. So, Brahmins in this period emerged as ideologues and as legitimizers of political power. They began crafting royal genealogies by assigning kings a respectable Varna status and performed important rituals and sacrifices. In some of the royal courts in Orissa, Brahmana donis served as priests, as astrologers, and as administrators. And although we have religious donations forming the majority of such donations, yet there were a few secular donations as well, wherein the kings granted land even in lieu of military service. Now, we would also like to talk of the Brahmadeyas in this context. Now, what were Brahmadeyas? Brahmadeyas were land grants given to Brahmins. All of this helped legitimizing political power even furthermore. Royal decrees declared and confirmed the rights of the Brahmana donis. And these royal grants were basically permanent, they were hereditary, and they were tax-free in nature. So, Brahmadeyas basically were autonomous rural entities which gave a free hand to Brahmana donis. Now, apart from royal patronage that was extended to the Brahmins, we also have patronage extended to the Buddhists and the Jains as well. So, here we would first like to talk of patronage that was extended to Buddhism. We know that Buddhist religious shrines and monasteries received royal patronage from the Palas of Bengal and Bihar. We have monasteries such as Nalanda, Odantapura, Vikramshila, Shompuri, all of which became important centers of Buddhist scholarship. In fact, Shanti Dev's Bodhicharyavatara described Mahayana rites of worship. And how did they describe them? We have snippets of images being bathed with scented water, where deities were offered food, flowers, and clothes, swinging censers within temple premises, burning incense, and performing vocal and instrumental music within the Buddhist monasteries. Donative inscriptions of the Moitrakas of Balavi also refer to provisions made to defray similar expenses. In fact, some monasteries grew into Mahaviharas and became owners of large landed estates. Speaking of patronage that was extended towards the Jaina saints and scholars, Jaina establishments also received considerable patronage from the Chapas of Gujarat, from the Paramara kings, from the Ganga rulers, from the Rashtrakutas, from the eastern and western Chalukyas, and of course the Kadambas. The colossal image of Gomateshwara or Bahubali, who was Adinatha's son, was ordered by Chamunda Raja or Chavunda Raya, who happened to be a minister of the Ganga king Racha Malla or Raja Malla. Furthermore, the eye-hole inscription of Pulakesin II also begins with an invocation to Jinendra, i.e., the lord of the Jinas. Donative inscriptions of the Pallavas, the Cholas, and the Pandyas across Tamil Nadu bear the names of several Jaina saints as well. Coming to temple patronage proper, we can say that a temple, the Latin word for temple was templum, which is a structure usually built for the purpose of and always dedicated to religious or spiritual activities, including prayer, meditation, sacrifice, and worship. Now, the construction and embellishment of religious establishments, such as temples, was therefore the result of patronage that came from diverse sources. As historian Hermann Kulke has put it, early medieval kings tried to buttress their authority by extending patronage to major pilgrimage places, i.e., the Tirthos, large-scale grants to temples, and the construction of imperial temples. Royal patronage also reflected the close association that kings sought to establish with certain deities and temples. Temples were therefore often constructed to commemorate royal victories and prove the greatness of emperors and empires. For instance, we have the Brihodeshwara temple at Tanjavur, built by the famous Chola emperor Raja Raja I. In this temple in particular, we have donations extended to it by the king himself, by his entire royal family members, and by the court, all of which went into the maintenance of this particular famous temple. So, temples basically functioned as the focal point of socio-economic activities. They served as artistic and intellectual scholarship hubs in both urban and rural areas. Temples could be grandly built and gifted by the monarchs themselves, or they could also be modest ones built by commoner collectives to benefit fellow citizens. Early medieval temples performed, therefore, multiple roles. They served as employers, as bankers, as centers of craft production, and agrarian stimulators through irrigation and reclamation of land. Speaking of patronage that was extended towards temples in Orissa in particular, we know that the famous, now that we worship the Jagannath temple, was earlier known as the Krittibash temple. Why? Because Orissa itself was originally a Shaivite region. From the 12th century onwards, however, worship of Purushottam, i.e., Lord Jagannath, began. And this particular worship was raised as an imperial cult following the construction of the Purushottam temple at Puri by the then Ganga king Anantavarman Choraganga, who sought to rival the grandeur of the Brihadeshwara temple at Tanjavur by constructing this particular temple. In 1230 Common Era, his successor Ananga Bhima III dedicated his empire to Purushottam, describing himself as the Lord's deputy. So here we have an instance of how kings too often sought to deify themselves. Coming to the patronage which temples in peninsular and South India received, we can say that royal donations to temples in South India, especially during the era of the Pallavas and the Cholas, also took the form of gold, land, livestock, and paddy. Like the earlier Brahmadiyas, royal land grants to temples were made in perpetuity and were associated with several tax exemptions and other privileges. Temples, therefore, leased out land to tenants, recruited hundreds of employees like dancing women, drummers, tailors, goldsmiths, dancing teachers, and accountants who were mostly paid in kind, i.e., in the form of rice or in the form of revenue assignments. We also know that apart from the royal potentates, even commoners and other important dignitaries also extended patronage. Although, as D.C. Shorkar would have us believe, land grant charters often camouflaged the real identity of the donors as well as the nature of the donative transactions. So, temple patrons often included chieftains, landowners, merchants, villages, town assemblies, artisanal groups, and merchant guilds. Now, while merchants donated money, livestock, gold, and silver ornaments, and land for the perpetual maintenance of temple lamps, weavers of Kanchipuram in particular managed the fiscal affairs of local temples. Now, amongst commoners, we also have women in substantial numbers offering patronage to temples. So, patterns of donations to religious establishments also shed light on women's participation in religious life, where they acted or they had proactive roles rather than that of invisible and the marginalized other. As historian Leslie Orr has studied the epigraphic evidences of women's patronage that was extended to Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, in her study of Tamil Nadu in particular, she has come up with the names of several women donors, amongst whom I mention only one, the 13th century Kakatiya queen Rudramadevi, who was a generous donor herself. Now, we know that there were religious women, i.e., comprising nuns and temple women, but besides them, there were other women who were either queens or they were women belonging to chieftains' families, wives of landowners, wives of merchants and brahmanas, who also extended lavish patronage to temple construction. All these women supported worship in shrines in the form of temple construction. They made and installed images. They also made provision for perpetual lamps, offered flowers and food for the deity, both on a daily basis as well as on festive occasions, and supported temple personnel in particular. So their gift giving was quite similar in nature to other categories of donors, both male and female. Leslie Orr has also stated that temple women of the Chola period, unlike the Devadasis of the 20th century, have been variously described. They have either been described as devotee of God or the daughter of God. Their identity was, however, not based on birth, on caste, on professional skill, or ritual function, but was based on their connection with either a temple or a particular deity or a specific place. Although evidence point to the fact that several of these women served as slaves, while a few of them even performed menial services, yet they were not tied to performing rituals or serving in managerial capacities. In the late Chola period, in particular, these unmarried temple women acquired special honors. They were allotted places close to the deities in processions or the right to sing parts of the hymns before the deities. Students, we have now almost reached the concluding part of our presentation today. So, by way of conclusion, we can say that the role played by patron kings and their political agendas behind temple patronage does occupy an important and interesting epoch in the annals of early medieval Indian history. Now, since ancient times, ecclesiastical and temporal powers in India have worked in tandem with one another. They have served as co-sharers in different arenas of statecraft. This was indeed far removed from the investiture contests that vitiated relationships between the royalty and the papacy in medieval Europe. The uniqueness of early medieval Indian history thus rests among other things, of course, on the fact that here the king, the clergy, and the temples occupied a triadic symbiotic space that came to be delineated not through mutual contestations and power rivalries of any kind, but through strategies of control, of alliance, and collaborations. Now, before ending my presentation, I would very briefly touch upon the salient features of this presentation. We would go through it once again. So, in this presentation of ours, we have basically tried to speak on the ideology of bhakti, of how the bhakti movement entrenched the feudal setup in India, and how there was a close alliance that was set up between the kings on the one hand and the brahmanas and the temples on the other. So we have basically a patron-client relationship, a patron-protege relationship to be precise. Now, why did the kings sort of patronize the temples? The reasons were many for the kings to patronize temples. Now, we know that early medieval India had a proliferation of different regional political groups. They were fledgling kingdoms who were in need of political legitimization. And this could come from patronizing the religious orders and the religious establishments. So, therefore, the kings, as well as, of course, the ordinary citizens, the ordinary laity, all of them began patronizing or began forming a bonhomie with religious established orders. Now, we have spoken of the Brahmadeyas, i.e., the land that was given to the Brahmins, and how it also sort of strengthened and helped consolidate the relationship between the religious and the political orders. We have spoken of the lavish patronage that was extended to both Buddhists and Jains, as well as the patronage that was extended to the Hindu religious shrines and temples. We have spoken of the temple patronage in Orissa, in peninsular India, in South India in particular, and how the ordinary commoners, especially women, came forward from their marginalized settings and became active supporters of temple construction, of image making, of worship, etc. So with this, we would like to conclude. Thank you.